Grabbed my wrist so firmly that I actually stepped back. His hand was shaking. "Where did you get this?" he said. Not loud, barely above a whisper. But the way he said it, like the air had gone out of him all at once, made everyone nearby go quiet. I looked down at the pin on my jacket lapel, the small silver one I'd found tucked inside an old coffee tin in my grandfather's closet 3 weeks after we buried him. "It was my grandfather's," I said. The man, white-haired, straight-backed, wearing a dark suit with a single row of ribbons I couldn't name, stared at me for a long moment. His jaw worked like he was trying to find words and kept losing them. "What was his name?" he finally asked. "Edmund Pruitt," I said. He closed his eyes, and I watched something move across his face that I still don't have a word for. My grandfather died on a Tuesday in February. I know that because I was the one who got the call, and I was sitting in my car in a Walgreens parking lot eating a granola bar when my phone rang. The nurse at the facility said he had passed quietly around 6 in the morning. She said he hadn't been in any distress. She said these things in the gentle, practiced way that people say them when they've said them many times before. I drove to the facility. I sat with him for a while. His hands were folded on top of the blanket, and I noticed, the way you notice small things at strange moments, that his knuckles were still thick and rough even at 81. He'd had a laborer's hand his entire life, even at the end. I called my mother from the parking lot afterward. She said, "I'll let everyone know." That was it. "I'll let everyone know." I want to be fair when I talk about my family. I want to say that people process grief differently, that distance, geographic and otherwise, makes things complicated, that my grandfather was not an easy man to know. All of those things are true. But he died at 6 in the morning, and no one had been there since Christmas. My mother had seen him for 40 minutes over the holidays. My uncle hadn't visited at all in the past year because, as he'd told me at Thanksgiving, driving up there on a weekday just isn't realistic with everything going on. My grandfather had lived 45 minutes from my uncle's house. I had visited him almost every Sunday for 3 years. I didn't say that to make myself sound good. I said it to explain why I ended up being the one to clean out his room. Nobody offered to help. My mother said she could come up the following weekend, maybe, if things settled down at work. My uncle said to just donate everything, that there wasn't really anything worth keeping. I went alone on a Saturday in early March with a box of garbage bags and a roll of packing tape. My grandfather's room was small and very neat. He'd never been a man who kept much. A few paperback westerns on the shelf, a framed photo of my grandmother, who had died when I was 7, a pair of reading glasses on the nightstand. The staff had packed his clothes into a bag already. I was mostly collecting the small things. The coffee tin was on the top shelf of his closet, pushed to the back behind a spare blanket. It was an old Maxwell House tin, the kind with the red and blue label, dented at the bottom. I almost left it. I thought it was probably just odds and ends, spare change, old buttons, the kind of small clutter that accumulates over a lifetime. I opened it in the parking lot. Inside, there was a folded piece of paper, a small silver pin about the size of a quarter, shaped like an eagle in profile, 2 keys on a ring with no identifying tag, and a photograph, black and white, of 4 men in civilian clothes standing in front of what looked like a government building. I didn't recognize any of them. My grandfather was not in the photograph. I turned the pin over. On the back, stamped into the metal in small letters, OSS, 1944. I didn't know what that meant. I put everything back in the tin, put the tin in my car, and drove home. I want to tell you about my grandfather the way I actually knew him, not the way I'll describe him later after everything I learned. He was quiet. He was the kind of quiet that some people find peaceful and other people find unsettling, and I think my mother landed in the second category, which is part of why things were the way they were. He didn't talk about himself. He asked questions, good ones, and he listened with his whole attention, which is rarer than it sounds. He made the same pot of coffee every morning. Folgers, 2 sugars, and he drank it standing at the kitchen window looking out at the yard. He had opinions about baseball and none whatsoever about politics, or none he'd share. He smelled like cedar and Old Spice. He told us almost nothing about his past before the 1960s. We knew he'd grown up in rural Pennsylvania. We knew he'd served in the army during World War II, but when we asked, he said only that he'd been a clerk, that he'd spent most of the war in England, that it had been cold and boring and he didn't like to talk about it. I believed him. We all believed him. He had the voice of someone telling the truth. I looked up Aus 1944, the night I got home. I sat at my kitchen table with the tin open in front of me and my laptop beside it. Aus, Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that preceded the CIA, active from 1942 to 1945, ran covert operations across Europe and Asia. Recruited from universities, law firms, corporations. Known for placing operatives in deep cover, sometimes for years. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I looked at the pin again, OSS 1944. My grandfather had told us he was a clerk. I didn't tell anyone. I wasn't sure what there was to tell. I put the tin on my bookshelf and kept looking at it, the way you keep looking at something you don't understand. 2 months later, I was invited to a veterans history dinner at a university in the city. I'd been volunteering with a local history nonprofit for a couple of years, mostly helping them catalog donated documents and photographs, and they'd included me on the invite list for an annual fundraiser. It was a sit-down dinner in a banquet room, mostly older people, a few academics. The kind of event where people wear blazers and talk earnestly about preservation. I wore the pin. I don't know exactly why. I'd been wearing it for a few weeks by then, absently, the way you wear something that means something without being able to say what. I'd clipped it to the lapel of my dark jacket and walked into the dinner without thinking much about it. I was at the bar waiting for a glass of water when the man appeared at my elbow. He was in his mid-80s, I'd guess. Tall even with the slight stoop that age had given him. Dark suit, the row of ribbons, a bearing that made the room feel smaller around him. He said, "Excuse me." I turned. He was looking at the pen. And then he asked me where I got it, and his hand was shaking, and everything changed. His name was Franklin Cobb, retired from the Army in 1987, the rank of Brigadier General. He had been, before a long military career, a very young man recruited by the OSS in the summer of 1944. He was 19. He'd been training to be a civil engineer at Penn State when a man in a gray suit came to campus and offered him a different kind of work. He said all of this in the hallway outside the banquet room. We had both drifted away from the crowd without planning to. A server passed us with a tray. Neither of us took anything. "Who was your grandfather?" he asked me again, and I told him the full name and the town in Pennsylvania and the approximate timeline, and I watched his face go through something complex and quiet. "Ed Pruitt," he said, not a question, like he was testing the name in his mouth after a very long time. "You knew him?" "He was my handler," Franklin Cobb said, "from September of '44 through the end of the war." I didn't know what to say to that. I don't think I said anything for a moment. "He was not a clerk," the general said quietly. And there was something in his voice that was not quite a laugh and not quite grief. "He was one of the best field coordinators the OSS had in the Western Theater. He managed a network of informants across 3 occupied territories. He did it under civilian cover, completely deniable, for 18 months. After the war, he stayed on for a few years with the successor programs." He paused. "He never told you any of this?" "He told us he was a clerk," I said, "that it was cold and boring." Franklin Cobb smiled. It was a slow, tired, genuine smile. "That sounds like him," he said. We talked for 2 hours. We missed most of the dinner. At some point, a woman I recognized from the nonprofit came over to ask if everything was all right, and I told her we were fine, just talking, and she looked at us both and went back inside. Franklin Cobb told me things that I am still, even now, working to absorb. My grandfather had been recruited because of his language skills. He spoke German and some French, a product of growing up in a community with strong German immigrant roots, and because of what a professor had apparently described in a letter as an unusual steadiness under pressure. He was placed in a network operating out of a small city in southern France. His cover was a commercial buyer for an American textiles company. He traveled. He asked questions. He listened, the way I'd always known him to listen, with his whole attention. In the winter of 1944, he helped extract a French mathematician who had been working under coercion for a German weapons program. The extraction took 3 weeks and required my grandfather to cross a checkpoint 4 times with forged papers. The mathematician survived the war. His work often contributed to early computing research. Your grandfather never fired a weapon in the field, Franklin Cobb told me. He didn't need to. His gift was being completely invisible. He looked like nobody. He acted like nobody. He could sit across from someone for an hour and they'd walk away remembering nothing about him. He paused. In our work, that was the rarest possible talent. I thought about how my grandfather had moved through family gatherings, how he could be in a room full of people and somehow not accumulate attention, how my uncle had once described him dismissively as just kind of a gray man, how I'd always found that quality oddly comforting rather than off-putting, though I'd never been able to explain why. Why didn't he ever tell anyone? I asked. Franklin Cobb looked at me steadily. Some of it was security. The networks didn't fully declassify until the 90s, and even then there were pieces that stayed buried. But I think for Ed it was also something else. He was quiet for a moment. I knew men who needed people to know what they'd done, who carried it like something heavy and needed to set it down somewhere. Ed wasn't like that. He thought, and he told me this directly, once very late in the war, that the work was the thing, not the recognition of the work, that if you'd done it right by definition no one would know. I sat with that for a while. He had a daughter, I said. Yes. My mother. She didn't visit much. Toward the end, his last few years. Franklin Cobb didn't say anything. I don't think she knew him, I said. I don't think she ever really tried. And I used to be angry about that. I used to think she was just cold. But sitting here now, I'm wondering if part of it was that he was so impossible to know, if the same thing that made him good at what he did made it hard for him to let people in. Probably, the general said simply. Probably both things were true. I drove home very late. I sat in my car in my driveway for a long time before going inside. I thought about my grandfather standing at the kitchen window with his coffee. I thought about the way he asked questions and really listened. I thought about all the Sunday afternoons I'd spent with him, eating sandwiches and watching baseball and talking about nothing much, and how comfortable that nothing had always felt. I thought about the fact that he had been, at 19, one of the steadiest people his organization had, and that he had carried that in his chest his entire life and said almost nothing. I thought about my mother saying, "I'll let everyone know," and going back to her day. I don't want to make this into something too simple. I don't want to say that my mother was wrong about everything and I was right about everything, or that knowing my grandfather's history excused the distance in our family or explained it away. Families are more complicated than that. People are more complicated than that. But I kept coming back to the comment a woman had made to me once, years ago, about her own grandfather who had served in Korea. She'd said that the men who'd actually been through the worst of it were often the ones who said the least, and that their silence was so complete that the people around them sometimes mistook it for absence, for not caring, for having nothing inside. My grandfather had everything inside. He'd just learned a long time ago to keep it there. I called my mother the next morning. I told her about the dinner and Franklin Cobb and what he'd told me about Grandpa's service. I told her about the OSS and the networks and the extraction in France. I read her some of what I'd written down in my car the night before. She was quiet for a long time. I didn't know any of that, she said finally. I know. He never said anything. I know, Mom. Another long silence. I should have visited more, she said. It came out flat and tired, like something she'd been holding for a while and had finally stopped trying to hold. Yeah, I said. Me too sometimes, not as much as you. But yeah. She asked if she could see what was in the tin. I said, of course. We made plans for her to come up the following weekend. It wasn't a reconciliation scene. It wasn't a tearful realization moment. We are not, as a family, built for those. It was just two people on the phone in the morning acknowledging, quietly, that something had been missed and that the missing of it was real. That felt like enough. That felt like the kind of thing my grandfather would have understood. I've been in touch with Franklin Cobb twice since the dinner. He's in his mid-80s and his health isn't perfect, but his mind is sharp and he speaks about the past with the careful precision of someone who has spent decades thinking about what to say and what not to say. He gave me the name of a historian at a university in Washington who studies OSS operations in France. He said she might be able to tell me more. I haven't called her yet. I'm not sure I'm ready for more. What I have done is put the photograph from the tin in a frame and set it on my bookshelf beside the Maxwell House tin itself. Four men in civilian clothes in front of a government building. My grandfather is not in the picture. I've decided that's appropriate. He wouldn't have been. The pin I still wear sometimes, not every day. On the days when I feel like I need a reminder about something. About what it looks like to do the work without needing anyone to watch you do it, about what kind of steadiness it takes to carry something serious and not let it change the quality of your presence, about how it's possible to move through the world leaving almost no mark and still matter deeply in ways that take years to surface. My grandfather was nobody. He was a gray man, as my uncle said. He made the same pot of coffee every morning, and he asked good questions, and he listened, and he had been, 60 years before I knew him, one of the invisible people who held certain things in place so that other people didn't have to know those things needed holding. There's a word for that, I think. Not hero, exactly. That word has gotten loud and complicated. Something quieter. Something that doesn't need you to know it to be real. I keep thinking about the Maxwell House tin, the dented bottom, the faded red and blue label, pushed to the back of a closet shelf behind a spare blanket like it was hiding or being hidden. My grandfather put it there. He could have thrown it away 100 times over 60 years, and he didn't. That was a choice. I think about that choice a lot. There's a version of the story where I leave the tin on the shelf, where I figure it's just spare change and old buttons, and I bag it up with the rest of the room. I almost did that. If I had, Franklin Cobb would have shaken someone else's hand at that dinner, or no one's, and my grandfather would have stayed exactly what my uncle always thought he was, a gray man, a quiet nobody, someone you didn't need to make the drive for. The tin was still there because my grandfather had integrity about his work even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. That's the thing I can't stop turning over. He wasn't quiet because he had nothing to say. He was quiet because he understood, at 19 years old in occupied France with forged papers in his coat pocket, that the work itself was the point. Not the story you told about it afterward. Not the room going still when you walked in. The work. He did it completely, and then he came home and made Folgers and watched baseball and asked good questions and let people think whatever they wanted about him. I used to think that kind of quietness was a limitation, a personality flaw maybe, or just shyness dressed up as dignity. I don't think that anymore. What my grandfather had was something rarer, the ability to carry something serious without needing it to define how other people saw him. That takes a specific kind of strength that isn't loud and doesn't announce itself. It just holds. What I'm still sitting with is the question of my mother. She didn't visit, she didn't ask. She took the silence at face value and filled it in with her own assumptions, that there wasn't much there, that he was just a gray man, that the drive wasn't worth making. And I understand it, a little now. His silence was so complete that it could look like absence. It could look like there was nothing inside worth reaching for. But here's what I think is true. Understanding why someone does a thing isn't the same as the thing being okay. My mother missed 30 years of Sunday afternoons because she didn't look harder. And my grandfather missed 30 years of being known by his own daughter because he never once offered her a way in. Both of those things happened and both of them mattered, and neither one cancels the other out. What I want, the thing I've been trying to hold on to since that night in the hallway with Franklin Cobb, is to be someone who looks harder, who asks the question, who makes the drive. Not because I'll always find something extraordinary at the end of it, but because the looking itself is the decent thing. My grandfather earned his silence. Most people haven't. Most people are just waiting for someone to sit down across from them and actually want to know. The pin is still on my jacket. I'll keep wearing it.